is Professor Jules Simner, and I run the Sussex University Imagery Lab. And the title of my talk today is How Do People with Aphantasia Think? So I'm going to start by defining aphantasia with a small request, which is I'd like you to think of a horse. Now, when most people think of something, when most people think of a horse, they're able to conjure up a picture of the horse in their mind's eye, a mental image. Now, it may not be as vivid as the horse in the field. It may be something a little bit more like this, but this ability to create a picture in the mind's eye is known as mental imagery. And importantly, it's an ability that varies across the population. So some people can conjure up an image in their mind which is as clear as the horse in the field. Other people have a less strong ability, and there's a small percentage of the population that has no ability whatsoever, or just anything they try is just vague and dim. And I'm down here because I have aphantasia. And many thanks to Tom, from the founder of the Aphantasia Network, for providing this very useful way for me to show other people what my mental imagery is like. So you might wonder, how do I know that I don't have mental imagery? Maybe I do, and I just think it's bad, but actually it's really good. Well, the reason I know that my imagery is absent or poor is because I did one time have a mental image. It was 1976, I was 5 years old, and I had been picking peas in the garden with my mum, and I had a mental image. I was in bed and I closed my eyes, and I had a perfectly crisp mental image of peas in front of my eyes. And it was absolutely fascinating. I couldn't believe it. It never happened to me before. I kept closing my eyes to look at the image, to look at the peas, and I slowly drifted to sleep. And I woke up in the morning and the ability was gone forever. I'd never been able to do it before, and I've never been able to do it since, but I've had one image, and that's how I know that my normal imagery is down here at the bottom. So am I unusual? Yes, I am, because aphantasia is quite rare. A recent study we ran in my lab found the prevalence of aphantasia to be 3.9%. We screened 1,000 people using a questionnaire that's known to be good for identifying people with aphantasia. And we found the prevalence to be 3.9%, which, if you want to imagine what that's like, it looks something like this. This is 100 people, and people with aphantasia be the ones wearing white. So quite rare amongst 100 people. But when you consider the entire population of the planet, that 3.9% is almost 300 million. It is 300 million aphantasics worldwide, which is almost the entire population of the United States, equivalent to that. And in fact, 14,000 people with aphantasia are born every day. And just in the course of this talk, 75 will be born. So, it's rare, but it's not insignificant. So I told you my imagery is bad. It's somewhere like this. But that raises the question of how people with aphantasia think if they don't have mental pictures. Now, the most important thing I want you to know to start with is that although I don't have a picture of the horse, I know everything about the horse. It feels I know everything about it. I know its color. I know that, it has a coat, it has a pattern, it's in a field, it has a nose. I know everything about the horse. I just don't have that knowledge as a picture. And it's quite interesting that I've chosen to show you what I know by using words, because we might wonder whether people with aphantasia are verbal thinkers. Now, this is a really sensible question, because there's a very large scientific literature on learning styles, and the assumption in that literature is that there's a trade-off. If you're bad at visual imagery, or if you're bad at visual thinking, you would be good at verbal thinking, and vice versa. So is that true? Are non-visual aphantasics really good verbal thinkers? And so we set out to find out. We tested 110 people with aphantasia and 70 controls who could make mental images. And we gave them a very nice new questionnaire. I recommend it. It is a questionnaire about thinking styles, and in particular, it can disassociate visual thinkers from verbal thinkers. So it has questions like this for visual thinking. My mental images are very vivid and photographic, so kind of visual imagery questions. And it also has questions for verbal thinking. So I hear words in my mind's ear when I think. Okay, so kind of like auditory imagery. And we gave this to our participants, and they rated each question on a 5-point scale for whether they strongly agreed or strongly disagreed or something in the middle. Did we find that people with aphantasia were verbal thinkers? No, we didn't. We did not. We found that they were low in visual thinking, but we know that they have aphantasia. But we also found they were low in verbal thinking. So blue is the visual thinking questions, and the aphantasics are in the darker colors. So you can see, unsurprisingly, aphantasics are poor at visual thinking, but they were also significantly worse at verbal thinking. They were not as good as the average person at verbal thinking. So they're low in visual and verbal thinking. So what does this mean? Does it mean that people with aphantasia show huge deficits? They're bad at visual thinking, they're not so good at verbal thinking. So, and I've written here in a very tongue-in-cheek way, am I barely sentient? And that's actually just a joking reference to something that a friend of mine said 20 years ago. She's a professor and she's a good imager. And when she found out I had no imagery, she said, "Oh, it seems like you're barely sentient. How are you thinking?" So just in a more serious way, we do want to find out whether people with aphantasia do show huge deficits if they're worse in these two domains of thinking. And in fact, this is certainly what sort of public consciousness might assume. This is a cartoon taken from the Guardian newspaper when they had an article about aphantasia. And you can see the man on the left with aphantasia is assumed to be thinking nothing at all and having a very bad life for it. So did we find that people with aphantasia show huge deficits? Well, no, we didn't. We actually found that they're typical or even superior in many visual verbal tasks. And I'm going to talk about 4 different types of tasks that we tested them on. So the first question we asked was, if people with aphantasia don't have visual images, does that mean that their memory for visual things is really faded and unclear and imprecise? So we took 50 people with aphantasia and 30 controls, and we gave them 12 line drawings of food. And we asked them to tell us from their memory, what color is this food? So we placed the food in the top right-hand corner of a color palette. The color palette always started at a random place. So here it randomly starts at green. And the task is to just adjust the color palette. So you pull the slider up until you hit yellow, and then find the exact shade of yellow in this color palette. And it's very, very sensitive. It's got 16 million different colors. And we asked the controls and the aphantasics to do this, and we gave them 12 line drawings of food, and actually half of the foods were really colorful foods like lemons and strawberries, and the other half were really faded foods like chickpeas and cauliflowers, which are kind of white and pale. And we just did that as a sanity check, just to make sure people were actually following the task. But we were really interested in how the aphantasics performed compared to controls. What we found was completely intact long-term color memory for people with aphantasia, no problem whatsoever. So the saturated foods in these left-hand bars were more saturated in the choices for colors chosen than the unsaturated food. So strawberries were given a more vibrant color than chickpeas. That's good, it's a sanity check. But really importantly, aphantasics had exactly the same knowledge of the exact shade of the colors of things from their memory as controls, no differences whatsoever. So that was their long-term memory for color. What about their short-term memory for color? So what if we give them a color, then we take it away and we ask them to recollect it? So that's what we did in this task here, the same participants. This time we had 6 target colors, and we placed the target color in the top right-hand corner of a screen with a color palette. Just like before, the color palette started in a random position, and we then took the target away and asked our participants to find the exact color that they'd seen from memory. So they would be dragging up the bar to red and finding the exact shade of red. So there were 3 steps to this test. We show the target color, we take the target color away, and then use the color picker to find it. Now, we really didn't want people to use their verbal knowledge here. So as well as giving very nameable colors, like, classic red, we also gave 6 colors that we know from the literature are very hard to name accurately. Now, what did we find? We actually found that people with aphantasia had better color memory than our controls. They did better on this task. So to understand this figure, you need to know that low bars are more accurate because the y-axis is showing an error score. It's showing how far away you were from the right answer. And what we find, first of all, as a sanity check, is that the nameable colours were better remembered than the less nameable ones, and that's what you would expect from everybody. But importantly, we found that the people with aphantasia were significantly more accurate than controls. So let's think now about other types of thinking and other types of knowledge, and let's turn now to memory for facts and events. Because a very nice recent study by Dawes and colleagues shows that people with aphantasia say they have bad memory for facts and bad memory for events in their life. And you can see that on their figure here. So this is aphantasics are saying, no, I'm not very good at factual memory and I'm not very good at autobiographical memory. So they say they're bad, but are they? So we tested this, we were testing a similar sort of thing, and we gave a direct test of factual recall in aphantasics and controls. We chose date recall as a sort of nice case of factual recall, and we showed on screen 65 world events in the past, like Hurricane Katrina. And the task was to simply type in the date that it had happened. So Hurricane Katrina happened in 2005. And we gave them 65 political events, very carefully selected across 6.5 decades. And we also gave them 70 cultural events. So a film, and they had to say what year it was the best Oscar, it was the best film for Oscars. And we gave them a song, and they had to say what year it was #1 in the hit parade. And we found here no deficit at all in factual recall. So people with aphantasia were just as good at this task as controls. So this is just one example. You know, it may be that people with aphantasia have other kinds of factual recall deficit. So, you know, I'm not saying this is the definitive answer. I'm just saying in one area that we tested, they had no deficit at all. So what about the, but I don't doubt we might find problems in other areas, it's possible. So now what about autobiographical or episodic memory? And this is really interesting. So there's a recent article by Watkins who describes himself, and he describes his aphantasia, and he describes his very poor autobiographical memory. But of course, that's just one person. But what's really interesting is this nice study by Milton and colleagues, where they took a group of people with aphantasia, and they did show that, in fact, they did have poor autobiographical memory. So I want you to know what they did, because we're going to just have a closer look at it. So they tested 24 people with aphantasia and 20 controls, and they got them to do all kinds of great tasks. It's a really lovely paper. But one of the tasks was they were asked to describe 2 events in their life. And then the experimenters scored the descriptions in 2 ways. They scored the descriptions for how much detail they had about the event itself. So the place it happened, the time it happened, what was seen and smelt and heard, and, you know, the emotions that were experienced. And then they also scored for surrounding factual information. So I'll give you a quick example so we know what we're talking about. So here's an example I plucked from my own head. So one morning, several years ago, I visited Craigmillar Castle in Edinburgh. There we go. This would be coded as time and place here in event information. I was so happy being there. That's the emotion. That would be coded for emotion score. And then I give a fact. Craigmillar is one of the best preserved medieval castles. And then I give a bit of context. I'd been planning to go ever since I moved to Edinburgh. And then I give some editorializing, you know, it was well worth the wait. And then I come back to the event itself, and I describe facts about the sensory and emotional facts about the event. So that's how it was scored. Now, really importantly, Milton and colleagues found that people with aphantasia gave far fewer details about the event. Okay, so it does look like there may be a deficit here. I just want to draw attention to one thing that may be important, which is that another part of this great study showed that the participants were introverts. The aphantasics were significant introverts. It may be just that cohort, or it may be a trend across all aphantasia, but something important we know about introverts is that they speak less face to face. And now in science, that's really important, because in a whole bunch of different types of experiments, introverts give fewer answers when they're asked open-ended questions. So I have a recent paper with Simner now that shows that introverts will speak less, they'll give fewer details. So, I think we might want to just reassure ourselves that this effect remains even when people are balanced for being introverts and extroverts. And actually, we had a study which sort of factored out the problem of introversion, because and that's just to say that the people with aphantasia really did say a lot fewer facts. They did speak a lot less than the people with people who had imagery. But yet we tried to find out about event memory in a way that won't be impacted by introversion. So we gave a group of people with aphantasia a test online where we never even saw them. We never spoke to them face to face. We just gave them a test and let them go away and do it at home. And in this test, we were listing events. We were asking participants to list events from their life in 9 different years. And we also gave them a typing test to check that the aphantasics weren't slow typers or anything like that. And actually what we found was no difference whatsoever between controls and aphantasics. So there was no difference at all in the number of events recalled when you do it online, not face-to-face. Now, I don't think these are actually conflicting. I rather suspect that what's going on here is that aphantasics are very good at listing things that have happened to them, but when you try to drill down on the specifics of the event, what did you took a bus somewhere, but what did the bus seat feel like, who was on the bus, all of those drill down details, I suspect, given this nice Milton paper, that aphantasics may struggle on that. And also, an important thing to know in the Milton data is that the aphantasics were actually quite chatty when it came to giving facts and context. And although they spoke a lot less overall, they did speak a bit more in this category. And that's important, I think, because we know that people with aphantasia have slightly higher autistic traits. So our recent study looked at autism in particular in aphantasia and found that aphantasics score higher on tests of autistic traits. And actually you tend to get more people with autism in aphantasic testing groups. Now that's important, I think, because what people with higher autistic traits will tend to do is give fewer emotional responses. So they would be coded less here, because people with autism also tend to have alexithymia, which is emotion processing problems. And they may well give more factual information, because we know autistic traits are higher in systemizing, and that makes you very good at sort of recognizing factual information. So that's what I think is going on there. So let's move away from the visual abilities and let's talk about verbal skills, because you'll remember that people with aphantasia were also bad at their, also scored low in verbal thinking in self-reports. But again, just like before, when we've tested them, it's been impossible for us to find deficits. So we found no deficits at all in spelling and none in vocabulary. We gave them a spelling test with 30 words like maintenance, where they click an icon and they hear someone saying maintenance. The engine requires maintenance, and then they have to type the spelling down here. And there was no problem whatsoever in their spelling ability. And we also gave them a test of sort of word meaning where they had to find synonyms and antonyms. And again, absolutely no problem whatsoever. The people with aphantasia were not struggling, despite saying that they're not verbal thinkers. So people with aphantasia have low visual and verbal thinking, but they don't seem to have huge deficits. Now, I'm not saying they don't have any, and I'll return to that in just a few minutes, but they certainly don't have dreadful deficits. So how are they thinking then, without low visual, low verbal, but no deficits? How are they doing this? And I'm going to end the talk by addressing this specific question: how do aphantasics think? Because we know that somehow they have visual and verbal knowledge without imagery. So what is this knowledge like? Now, the traditional idea would be that their knowledge must be abstract, and we say propositional, so something very not concrete at all. And this is certainly a view that has been proposed many times through the science of imagery. But what I'd like to suggest today is that actually the knowledge of people with aphantasia is in some ways representative and iconic, not abstract. Now, I need to tell you what I mean by iconic. And the interesting thing is that iconic thinking is usually used when we're talking about imagery. So imagine a real horse in a horse. Now, really importantly, this visual thought resembles the visual object in the world, and that's what it means to be iconic. Now, traditionally, it's been assumed that imagery is iconic and that non-imagery is not iconic. It cannot be iconic. And that's what I'd just like to challenge today with a study that we ran. So the question we were asking is, do aphantasics think iconically? So do their visual thoughts resemble visual objects? Or equally, do their verbal thoughts resemble verbal objects? And actually, it's this latter that we chose to test. So we took 110 people with aphantasia and 70 controls. And now the important assumption of this study is that these particular aphantasics will also have no mind's ear and a poor inner voice, just as we've suspected before. And if that's the case, we want to know, is their sound knowledge still iconic, even without imagery? So let's just start with a sanity check. Let's just make sure that we're making the right assumption about these people. We gave a nice questionnaire called the Clarity of Auditory Imagery. And this is a questionnaire that shows that people with aphantasia that we tested, they had no mind's ear. Okay, so in this questionnaire, you're asked to imagine sounds like the sound of a dog barking, and then you're asked to rate how much is that sound like a real world sound. We found that our aphantasics were saying there was no sound at all in their head. Almost exclusively, our aphantasics said, when I imagine a dog barking, there is no sound at all. I just know I'm thinking of a sound. Whereas our controls were much higher, and sort of some of them even had 5 scores, which was as realistic as the actual sound itself in real life. So we know that these have aphantasics, they have no mind's ear and they have a poor inner voice. Firstly, this is repeated data I gave you earlier. It shows they have a poor inner dialogue, and actually there's less thinking in dialogue completely, because they even talk to themselves less. So if they're walking around the house, they talk out loud to themselves, or they use it very little, and if they do, it certainly does not make a sound. Okay, so that is our assumption, and we're going to move forward on that assumption. So the question is whether their sound knowledge is still iconic even without this sound imagery. So the task was really simple. We gave them a passage to read, and they had to press a button at the end, and we looked at how fast they read. The manipulation was that half of the people who took part, we said that the passage was written by the world's fastest speaker, and the other half of our participants, we told them the passage was written by the world's slowest speaker. So the instructions went like this. You will see a passage of text written by a man called James Tylerson, who holds the as the fastest speaker in the world. Okay, so half the aphants were told fastest speaker and half the controls were told fastest speaker, and the other half were told he was the slowest speaker in the world. Please read the passage written by James Tylerson and press continue once you're done without rereading. And then there's a generic passage. Everything is identical across both conditions apart from this word here. Then you have a passage that starts, learning to speak as well as a Guinness World Record holder can feel like an overwhelming task, but just as a chef learns how to fry an egg or how to fillet a fish, blah, blah, blah. Now, really importantly, this passage is equally feasible with the having been written by the fastest speaker and the slowest speaker. It's just about how to train your speed of speaking. Now, what we found here was really interesting. We found that the people with aphantasia did have slower reading for a slow speaking author. Okay, so their verbal thinking did in some way resemble the verbal object in the real world. It was iconic, kind of like you would normally expect with images. Now you might think, well, maybe they did slow down, but probably not as much as someone with really strong auditory imagery. Well, that's not what we found. We found they did it just as well as controls. Even though they didn't have any sound in their head, they slowed down when they were thinking about a slow sound in the real world. So just to sum up then very quickly, we found, first of all, that people with aphantasia report low visual and verbal thinking, but did they have huge deficits? No, they really didn't. we found that they were either just as good as controls or even better than controls in all of these tasks, with this sort of question mark around autobiographical, where they seem to remember as many events, but they're not so good at drilling down into them. And actually, a very nice recent study that was handed to me yesterday seems to draw the same conclusions, that people with aphantasia are fine on visual memory tasks and actually can be better on spatial memory tasks. So do they show any deficits? Well, yes, they do. They do show some deficits. So I would point you to a very lovely paper by Bainbridge and colleagues that shows that when people with aphantasia are drawing things from memory, they draw fewer objects. The objects have the same number of details, except that they also use less color, which is unusual given that we know their color memory is superior, but there's a deficit there in the number of objects they recall. And our own lab has just shown that people with aphantasia are also significantly worse in face recognition tasks. So we gave them a task where they had to recognize faces, and they performed significantly worse than controls. So they have some areas where they're the same, some areas where they're better, some areas where they're worse. And do they have sort of neutral differences as well? Well, apparently, yes. So we know from the Milton study, we discussed that people with aphantasia focus on facts and context rather than a sensory, emotional time details of an event. And we also know from this recent paper that there are strategy differences as well. And is their thinking iconic? Does it resemble the world? You know, this is a very tentative yes. It's one interpretation of our data is that yes, that's potentially the case. So let's put it there for now, because iconic, they seem to have iconic thinking of voices without auditory imagery. So I just want to end on a light-hearted look at aphantasia, but with a slightly serious undertone, because I'd really like to explain how it is for someone with aphantasia to have other people assume they must have difficulty thinking, or worse still, that they have no imagination, which is another one I hear all the time, that imagery is the same as imagination. But of course it's not. So I've always scored really highly on tests of creativity and imagination, but I don't have any imagery. So I'm often forced to correct students who use the word imagination as synonymous with imagery, and you know, ditto thinking. So here's how I think of it. I think of it like picking apples. So I want you to imagine that there are two villages in Sussex, where I'm from, and both villages make their money from cider, so they're always picking apples because we have great apples here. Now, village one use mini trampolines. They bounce up and they grab the apples from the tree, and they've always done it that way. And they just can't conceive of doing it any other way. They've never once picked an apple without a trampoline. So much so that they think the very definition of picking apples involves a trampoline. And they feel really sorry for village two, because village two don't have any trampolines. But village two are fine. They pick plenty of apples. They just stretch really hard, reach up high, or they use a stick. But village one won't believe it. And in the end, they start suggesting that village two must have invisible trampolines, which they just don't know about. But village two secretly smile, because they know that picking apples means extracting them from a tree. And it really doesn't have anything to do with trampolines at all. And they kind of secretly feel sorry for village one, because it seems really effortful to have to use a big old trampoline just to reach an apple. So that's just a way I think about the lack of understanding between aphantasics thinking about images and images thinking about aphantasics. So thank you very much for listening, and a huge thanks to my lab and collaborators, especially to Carla Dance and Matt Jackery, who were really responsible for most of the data presented today. So thank you very much.